Today, our general session presenter is Ron Lippi. He is Professor Emeritus of our former UWMC. He is joining us. He said he has been doing this for 27 years, which is very impressive. His presentation today is 8 reasons why human races do not exist. And this will examine how human variability and DNA argue for the repudiation of racial categories. So please give a warm welcome to Ron Lippi.
Happy New Year, everyone. It's nice to be back in Wausau. As many of you know, my wife and I moved to Madison a couple years ago because our kids live there and our only grandchild lives there, so where else could we possibly live? But, it's nice to be back in Wausau. I think I stopped counting at 27, but I think this is now 29 or 30 years I've done Good Ideas. First time I've done the general session, so in those 29 years or whatever, I've presented more than 20 different anthropology and archaeology topics. And then one of these days I'm going to run out of topics and then you won't see me anymore. I'm keeping pretty busy in Madison. I have an office on campus, and I'm writing 2 books and editing a 3rd book and revising a 4th book. And they're all related to my archaeology project, which some of you have heard me talk about. So it's going slowly because I'm retired. It's not going fast. But anyway. This talk, I've given versions of this talk in a couple of my courses over the years, but I've had to do a lot of updating because there's so much new genetic evidence. But what I'm going to do is, first of all, obviously, if you look at that photograph up there, can everyone hear me, by the way? If you can't hear at any time, just start waving your hands or something. Obviously, there are 2 different races depicted there, and let me point them out, if I may. Within the red ellipse, we have the race of people who wear things around their necks. And the other 5 people do not. So you might think that that's a ridiculous way to categorize humans, but I'm going to try to make the point that it's no more ridiculous than the other ways we've done it. So let's get started. There are a number of misconceptions in this country and elsewhere and over much of the world about race. I'll just go through these quickly, and then we'll take it from there. First of all, the idea that humans can be divided into a small number of genetically distinct groups called races. This idea has been around at least since the time of the ancient Egyptians. In the 1700s in Europe, this became a really big deal, and lots of people were trying to categorize humans. In all cases, the races they came up with, whether it was 3 or 30, they were ranked from superior to inferior. And you can imagine the ones that looked the least like Europeans were at the bottom of the scale. And even as anthropology got started as a discipline in the late 1800s, in early 1900s, there was a lot of interest among anthropologists early on to continue and to systematize these racial classifications. But ever since the 1940s with Ashley Montagu, everybody remember Ashley Montagu from Johnny Carson? Great British anthropologist. He was really the first that started publishing and arguing vigorously against racial classification. And ever since then, anthropologists have gradually shifted away from such classifications to a repudiation of them. For reasons that I think are pretty good. And I want to point out, we're not talking about political correctness here. That's a term I don't like because I think it's very dismissive. But what I'm going to present, I'm giving you 8 reasons, and 7 of them are based on scientific criteria. And only the 8th one is basically a political summary. So I'm not just talking about, well, anthropologists think it's bad to talk about races, so let's not talk about them anymore. It's much more scientific than that. So at any rate, this is basically the general conception about what a race is. So we're talking about genetically past traits, biological differences among humans. And most people who believe this also believe that races have been around basically since the beginning of time, whether you see that as a creationist or as an evolutionist, from whatever, from Noah, if you're a creationist, or from very, very early time of human evolution. It turns out these first three widely held beliefs are all totally incorrect. The third one, a lot of people around the world believe that if you know what race a person belongs to, then you know something about their aptitudes, their abilities, their lack of abilities, their level of intelligence, whether they're hardworking or lazy and so forth. All sorts of attributes are attached to these races. And of course, that quickly takes us into racism and discrimination. The fourth misconception is the only one I've underlined it because it's the only one about which there is a kernel of truth. The others are completely wrong. But this one is that races are associated with particular continents or regions of the world. So let's go to this photograph. On the left there, I see a bunch of people look different from each other, and I can look at some of these people and say, well, this woman here, I'm guessing that she has some recent ancestors from somewhere in Europe, okay? Or this gentleman right here, probably some recent ancestors from Africa. And we can do this with a few others. This individual back here may be from New Guinea, or his ancestors from New Guinea, or perhaps Northern Australia. So we can do this, and we do it all the time. And I can look around this room and I can see, oh, wow, a lot of European ancestry in here, isn't there? But of course, it's very easy to make mistakes about this, but this is the kernel of truth. You can look at somebody and sometimes correctly identify where some of their recent, and I say some, of their recent ancestors are probably from. On the right, that's my son David. He went to Egypt with me about 10 years ago, and it was interesting. My wife is Latina, and David looks a lot like my wife, thank goodness. Everywhere he went in Egypt, people thought he was Egyptians thought he was Egyptian. And I can't tell you how many times people walked up to him and started speaking Arabic to him. And in fact, one time we were waiting for the train at the railway station in Cairo, and a couple police officers came up to him on the train platform and started speaking to him in Arabic. Of course, he didn't understand Arabic, and our guide went over to intervene, and the police were asking him in Arabic why a young Egyptian man was following these American tourists around. So it's easy to make mistakes. Okay, so I've divided my 8 reasons up into categories. The first 2 reasons basically have to do with definitions and misuse of words. The important word, of course, is race. So reason number 1, race is a biological concept, and it simply can't be applied to humans for reasons I'm going to explain. Here we have some examples of races, some different races of tigers. These are all, on the basis of DNA, they've all been identified as the same species, but there are 6 different races or subspecies now identified in the world. Or wolves, Canis lupus, all of these are different subspecies or races. In fact, race and subspecies are virtually the same word. Okay, the important thing about race, the definition in biology is a race is an isolated breeding population within a species. Isolated breeding population. That means there is a group of animals, if we're talking about tigers, that live within a particular region. They breed among themselves. They rarely have the opportunity to breed with other populations of tigers because they're separated biologically. Sometimes there are other reasons, or geographically. They're separated geographically. And so after thousands of years of relative isolation, they develop a distinctive gene pool, distinctive physical characteristics. They can still breed with other tigers if they're brought into contact, but they're usually not in contact, so they usually don't breed. And that's the definition of a race. So as I say, it means the same as a subspecies. And distinctive gene pool, and their distinctive traits. So if I went back to the previous picture of the lions or the wolves or the fish, you would see that they all have a little bit different physical characteristics. They're all able to breed with each other within each group. Okay? This doesn't apply to humans. Humans do not form isolated breeding populations for any significant length of time. The one thing I want you to get out of this talk this morning is that humans are all mongrels. We move around a lot around the surface of the earth, and wherever we move, we breed with the people that are already there. And that has been our history for thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years. And let's just take a couple of examples. You might say, well, how about the Amish here in the United States? The Amish try to live separately from the rest of society, and they hate to use the word breed with humans, but they marry among themselves, and they really keep to themselves as much as they can. And that's true, and this has been going on for over 200 years, which is not a long time in terms of evolution. Turns out that in Amish communities today, from anywhere from 1 out of 10 to 1 out of 3 Amish children will grow up and leave their community. So that they're losing a lot of members. The ones that stay in the community, they're not growing as fast as they used to be. And this is a community which is partially reproductively isolated, but it's not isolated to a high enough degree, and they will not be able to maintain that isolation for thousands of years necessary to become a separate gene pool. And therefore, it's certainly not appropriate today, and I doubt that it'll ever be appropriate in the future to consider them a separate race within humanity. The other group here, these are Yanomamo native peoples who live deep in the Amazon rainforest and along the Venezuelan-Brazilian border. The Yanomamo were mostly unknown to the outside world before the 1960s. People say, wow, we didn't know about them, they must be an isolated breeding population. No. The fact that we didn't know about them, that's our ignorance. They were there and they were breeding with other tribes around them that were breeding with other tribes around them that were breeding with other tribes around them that were breeding with Spanish and Portuguese and all the rest of us. They're part of the world's gene pool. They're not isolated. The fact that we don't know much about them or we didn't know much about them in the 1960s is irrelevant. And so again, we have to be careful. We just have to keep in mind we don't have any good examples of populations really being separated, completely cut off for at least many, many centuries, if not for a few thousand years, to develop this separate gene pool. Perhaps the last true race or subspecies were the Neanderthals, who died out some 30,000 years ago. And we now know from studies of their genome that Neanderthals did breed to a small degree with modern humans in Europe and Asia. And most of us in here, on average, probably have about 2% of our genome comes from Neanderthals. But that's what you call an isolated breeding population, and it was for tens of thousands of years. Okay, number 2, we're still on the matter of definitions here. So races are supposed to be biological categories based on isolated breeding populations, right? It turns out that most people in this country and elsewhere around the world use race incorrectly, and it is used as a social construct, that it is defined by social or cultural differences, ethnic differences, not biological ones. And that's incorrect use of the word. That's not what it means. Okay? It confuses things terribly when we say race when what we mean is ethnicity or culture. Ethnicity and culture are learned behaviors. What we wear, what we eat, what language we speak, what gods we worship, and so forth. Those are all cultural, that's learned behavior. It's not biological behavior. It's not passed down genetically. So this is a terrible, terrible confusion. Let me just illustrate with a few examples. Here we have 2 quite different, pretty little girls. One on the left I think we probably classify as white, and the one on the right as black. And what's interesting about these 2 little girls is that they are twin sisters. Not identical twins, obviously, but they are fraternal, or more correctly, sororal twins. And here's their family, Here's their family portrait. Their mother is from Jamaica, their father's from England. Number of children there, nice looking family. Isn't that amazing? How can you say that twin sisters belong to two different races? Makes no sense, does it? A lot of you probably remember Pelé, who's often still considered the greatest soccer player who ever lived. Led Brazil to 3 World Cup championships back in the 60s, more or less. Pelé, as you can see, was a very dark-skinned man. Brazil has a very complicated mixture of African Americans. They have more slaves in Brazil than anywhere in the Americas. Native Americans and European Americans, primarily of Portuguese extraction, but not entirely. It's quite a mix of people, and they define races in many different ways in Brazil. But Pelé, back in the 1960s, when he was at the height of his game, had, like every other Brazilian citizen, he had an identification card which, among other things, listed his race. And he was listed as white. And the reason he was listed as white, it's been explained to me by Brazilians, is because there's a saying in Brazil that money whitens. And no matter what your skin color is, your race is determined ultimately by your wealth. And Pelé, by this time, of course, was a wealthy man and very, very highly thought of throughout Brazil and throughout the world. So he was considered white despite being a very dark-skinned man. That's an example of a social construct. It has nothing to do with biology. Here's another example. In Japan, there are people in Japan called the Buraka or Burakuman, who are, by many Japanese, even today, considered to be a separate race of people and considered to be an inferior race. Genetically, they are no different from other Japanese. You cannot distinguish them by looking at their genomes. Historically, they are a different caste. They were a different caste within old medieval Japan. They were basically rural peasant people. They were, in some parts of Japan, considered untouchables. And their descendants today are still discriminated against in many places. And they are considered to be a separate race of people. They're not a separate race. They were a separate social class centuries ago. But that stigma has remained today. That's a social construct. It has nothing to do with genetic differences because they're not genetically different from other Japanese. Or how about these 3 guys? Famous black Americans, right? Yeah, sort of. I got the word hypodescent over on the right. I'll talk about that in a minute. Let's see who their parents are. You probably know some of this. For Barack Obama, as you probably know, his father was from Kenya, a member of the Luo tribe in Kenya. His mother was from Kansas, and she was primarily English, but also had Welsh, Swiss, Irish, and German ancestry. And Tiger Woods, his mother was from Thailand, but she was part Thai, part Chinese, and she said she also has Dutch ancestry. His father was African American, part Native American, and also claimed to have Chinese ancestry. So why do we call Tiger Woods black? Why do we call Barack Obama black? Roy Campanella, I don't know if you remember Roy Campanella, a great catcher for the Brooklyn Dodgers. He was tragically involved in a car accident and became paralyzed, and that ended his career. But Roy Campanella, Campanella is an Italian name. His father was an Italian American. His mother was African American. But he wasn't considered an Italian baseball player, and there were lots of Italian baseball players, quite famous ones back in the 50s, right? No, he was considered a black baseball player. Why are they categorized as black when they're a multitude of things? And it gets back to this term hypodescent. In our society and in many societies, people of mixed ancestry are often placed in the lowest ranking group. And in the United States, traditionally, that has been African Americans. So they are considered African American even if they're only part, half, or less African American. Remember back in slave days in the South, you had quadroons who were 1/4 African, Achtuns. Somebody in some states could be 1/64th African, and they were considered Negroes, right? This makes no sense genetically. It's what we mean by social construct, that our concept of race is constructed by social rules, not by biological rules, and that's a misuse of the term. Same thing is happening and has been happening for a long time with Native Americans. To claim membership in a tribe, they have to, in many cases, show their blood quantum. And for the Cherokees, well, the Cherokees are a complicated story, but they have some members that are 1/16th or 1/32nd Cherokee, and yet they qualify as Cherokees. For other tribes, it doesn't go down that low, but Cherokees are a special case for historical reasons. At any rate, again, this is a social construct. It has little or nothing to do with biology. Okay, let's go on to some other kinds of definitions. In order to identify races, we have to do some classifying. We have to put people into categories. And I'm going to give you 3 reasons why this is done incorrectly. Okay? First thing we need to know before I go into these 3 reasons is that a lot of the so-called racial traits are actually adaptations to different environmental conditions around the world. And I'll give you some examples. The easiest example to talk about is skin color. And that's an obvious difference among humans. Some are very light-skinned, some very dark, and a lot of people in between. And it turns out, we've known this for a long time, that skin color in humans correlates very well with ultraviolet radiation. So on the top here, this is a map of ultraviolet radiation on Earth. It is most intense. The blues, purples are the most intense. At the other end of the scale, well, there's another blue up here that's where it's least intense. Wish they would have used another color instead of blue again, but at any rate, near the equator, this is where the sun is most directly overhead, and so the solar radiation penetrates the Earth's atmosphere with the least amount of disturbance, and that's where ultraviolet radiation is most intense. And lo and behold, that's where the darkest people on Earth have lived for tens of thousands of years. And as people moved away from the equator, they needed vitamin D, and with dark skin, vitamin D is hard for the body to synthesize. And so there were mutations that occurred fortuitously, and those people survived because they had lighter skin outside of the tropics. And it's more complicated than this. It has to do with folic acid deficiency and other things too. But we can relate it on a simple basis to ultraviolet radiation. If you live near the equator, in a very sunny zone, if you live deep in the jungle, it doesn't matter that much. But if you live out in an open environment like in East Africa, having very dark skin will protect you from skin cancer and folic acid deficiency, which can prevent childbirth. If you live farther away, farther north or farther south, it is advantageous for the synthesis of vitamin D to have lighter skin. Okay? And it turns out that most of these so-called racial traits are related to environmental factors like this. Although they're all related to different factors, it turns out that people that live near the equator tend to have a more linear body build. Their skeletal proportions are narrower, lengthier. People that live farther north or farther south, of course, the continents are such that most of the people living away from the equator live in the northern hemisphere because there's a lot more land to the north. They tend to have a more lateral build, stockier, shorter, thicker bones, and so forth. So here we've got someone from East Africa on the left, and an Inuit or Eskimo from the American Arctic on the right. These are kind of 2 extremes, and most people on Earth are going to fall in between that. And you as an individual, you don't have to follow this pattern. There's a lot of variability. But in general, people near the equator tend to be more linear. Near the poles tend to be more lateral. And it has to do with retaining body heat or dispelling body heat. If you live in a hot climate, you want to get rid of your body heat. If you live in a cold climate, you want to retain it. And linear versus lateral does that. It's a simple matter of heat transfer. And in fact, we can even graph it out. It's called Bergmann's rule. There are a couple other similar rules in biology. But basically, the warmer your climate, the more linear you tend to be. This applies not just to humans, but to all kinds of warm-blooded animals. Look at hair curl. Well, what can I say? It's nice to be in a room where there are other students who are bald. Hair texture, the curl of the hair can vary from no curl at all, very, very straight hair, to wavy, to curly, to very tightly curled, spiraled. There are all kinds of names for it. But here you see some of that variety here. It turns out that hair texture, as we call it, is related to solar radiation, the amount of sun that you get in your environment, how directly overhead the sun is, and it is also related to insulating the head. So when I go out this morning, it was what, 4 below or something, and I had to put my stocking cap on because I lose a lot of heat this way. If you have a thick head of hair, you don't need to worry about that so much. And the same in the summer sun, I have to wear a baseball cap or something, or my Tilly hat, because I need to protect my head from the sun. And basically, the texture of your hair helps to do this, and populations throughout the world tend to have a hair texture in general that protects them from too much solar radiation and protects them from too much heat loss or too much heat absorption. Nose shapes. Italian nose, Roman nose. Very proud of it. Your nose and your ears keep growing in old age. And every time I see my old high school classmates, they say, you look more and more like your father. And that's because my nose keeps growing. My father had an enormous Roman nose. And I'm getting there. At any rate, it turns out that, your nose, besides filtering air, it humidifies air, which is good on a dry winter day like this, and it warms the air. So if you go outside today and you breathe through your mouth and you breathe through your nose, you'll notice it's significant difference, because through your nose the nasal passages warm the air quite a bit. And it turns out that the shape of your nose and the length of the nasal passages and the narrowness of them and so forth is related to both humidity and to cold. So these are examples, and I used to lecture for 2 or 3 days on just these environmental adaptations. I have to go through it really quickly here, but these are examples of so-called racial traits that are really adaptations to different environmental conditions. Okay, so something happened to my box there, but you can still read that. So let's get into these 3 classification problems. Remember, most racial traits are adaptations, not all. Eye color is probably not an adaptation to the natural environment, but skin color clearly is, and so are many other traits. At any rate, the problem is a lot of these traits are what biologists call clines, and it is impossible to subdivide clines and put them into separate categories. I'll give you an example. First, a definition. A cline is a trait that varies gradually from one place to another. So I'm told, I'm not an expert on zebras, but one particular species of zebra in Africa, if you go from the northern end of its range to the southern end, the number of stripes on the zebra increases or decreases. I don't remember which. But it's a very gradual change. Did you see that on your safari? Okay. Depends which way you're going, whether it increases or decreases. But there's a slight change. That's what's called a cline. Okay? It's not that some zebras have 38 stripes and others have 45 stripes, and there's nothing in between. There's 38, 39, 40, 41. It's a very gradual change, at any rate. Maybe that wasn't a good example because I know so little about zebras, but let's talk about humans. So let's not talk about humans. Let's talk about Martians. Okay, so let's imagine that we are on Mars. We are Martians, indigenous Martians, and we have gotten a grant from the Martian Academy of Sciences to take our spaceship to Earth and to observe human diversity on Earth. And, it's nice, but it's expensive to get to Earth, and so we can't stay very long. We can only make a couple of stops on Earth. So our spaceship first lands in East Africa, lands in Kenya, and we get out, and we're invisible, so people are not shocked by our presence. And we get out, and we observe, and we take some notes on our iPads, because they have iPads in Mars. And what we notice is that most of the people look, kind of like this. Very dark-skinned and very curly hair and so forth, and broad, flat noses and all those characteristics. And say, okay, well, that's very interesting, wow. And then we got one more stop, and then we got to head back to Mars because it's a long voyage. So they go north to Sweden. They get out in Sweden, and they come upon a little Yule festival, and they see, wow, these people really look different. Holy cow, people are very, very light-skinned and light-colored hair and so forth. And so they go back to Mars and they report to the National Academy or the Martian Academy of Sciences there are basically two races of people on Earth. Very dark-skinned, very light-skinned. Okay, what's the problem with that study? They missed everything in between. What they needed to do was to park their spaceship and rent a Land Rover and drive from Kenya to Sweden, which you can do. Okay. And if you do that, I've mapped out the route because I've done this a couple times. And as you go through these various countries, snap some pictures of the people along the way. And, well, here we got some Somalis and some Egyptians and some Greeks and Italians. Oh, the Italians got Romanians, Germans. We skipped some other countries. But what do you notice about skin color? Gradually gets lighter and lighter and lighter and lighter. So my question is, at what point did you leave the land of black people and enter the land of white people? And the answer is it's impossible to say because it's not two lands. There's a continuous distribution in skin pigmentation from very dark to very light as you go from Kenya to Sweden. So because this is a cline, this is what we mean by a cline, skin pigmentation in humans is a cline, you can't subdivide it in a meaningful way. Now, cosmetologists and scientists also have little gadgets like this, where they can actually measure your skin tone. Cosmetologists do it on your face because women are looking for makeup, I guess. Scientists will do it under your arm where you don't get tan because they want to know what your actual skin color is. But, and they have scales. This is one of many different scales of skin color. Melanin is what makes your skin brown, or if you don't have much melanin, not so brown. There are a couple other pigments. Well, hemoglobin, your blood flowing through your system, also can make you more reddish. And there's keratin. But melanin is the principal pigment involved in human skin color. And this chart just shows some of the variation. I don't think it's a particularly good chart, but let's use this because each tone here has a color. So it goes from 1 to 36. So we'll put 1, we'll call these people white. And down here towards 36, we'll call them black. And then in between, dark brown, light brown, and red or yellow, whatever you want to call them. We have these ridiculous names for skin colors, and none of these are really very, very accurate. But at any rate, the problem is, well, what if we have one person who is 36 on the scale and another is 33? It's not really the same color, but we're putting them into the same category. We're calling them both black. And yet we have another person who's 32, and to the naked eye, you can barely tell the difference between 33 and 32, but we're saying they belong to two different races. You have to make divisions, and you have to cut it off. And by doing so, you're exaggerating differences, and you're putting people together who don't belong together, and you're separating people who look virtually alike to the human eye. So this is a problem anytime you're working with clines. And the reason this is a cline, I don't know how many of you remember Gregor Mendel's experiments with peas where he set the foundations of modern genetics. He would breed peas, and he found, for example, that peas came in two colors, yellow and green. And if you mixed them, they had so many yellow and so many green in the next generation. There were only yellow and green peas. There weren't peas that were kind of yellowish, greenish in between, either yellow or green. And that's because there was just one gene that coded for pea color. Humans are not just black or white because there's more than one gene that codes for human skin color. There are probably 8 to 12. Geneticists now believe they've identified 5 mutations that converted very dark-skinned people into very light-skinned people. And because there are multiple genes, you can get this continuous distribution. You can get people that are all shades in between, which you can't get with peas because there's only one gene, either you're green or you're yellow. No other options. Unless there's a mutation, but at any rate, the point is you cannot subdivide this continuum. Anytime you try to subdivide it, you're creating deceptive categories that don't really exist. And almost all human racial traits that have been used historically are clines. They cannot be subdivided. You can't break them up into categories. You can't say that this person is black and this person is white, You got most humans are in between, and it is impossible to put them into categories. Am I explaining that well? Does that make sense? I haven't done this kind of lecturing for years, so, okay. Very important, though, the fact that most of these traits are clines means that classification becomes impossible. Any attempts at classification are pure illusion. Second problem, which is the fourth overall, is that the racial categories assume that different traits come together, that they're codependent, they vary together. So I went to an old anthropology book from the 1920s, and I picked out a classification of Negroid peoples. And there it is. I've reworded a little bit, but basically, hair is black, coarse, tightly curled, heads are long and narrow, bodies are slender and tall, skin from light brown to black, and so forth. Nose is broad and flat. That would be a typical racial definition from the 1920s. Okay? Now, the problem with this, and if you go on and read about it, they will tell you that there are so many, a certain fraction of humanity has all of these traits, and they are called Negroids. Well, there are certainly a lot of people on Earth today that have all of those traits. But for every person that has all 7 of those traits, I can probably find 7 million who have 6 of them, or 5 of them, or 4 of them, or 3 of them, or 2 of them, or 1 of them. And how do you classify them? They don't go together. Your body build is not dependent upon your skin color. They are independent variables. As is your nose shape, as is your hair texture, as are other racial traits. They vary independently of each other. They don't come in packages. Which means the package idea is that if you have black skin, you also must have black, tightly curled hair. You must also have broad, flat nose. You must also have a linear build. And that's simply not true for most people. Most people on Earth are going to have 1 or more of those traits, but not all of them. And racial classification doesn't allow for that. So the classifications are automatically eliminating the great majority of humans on Earth. You can't put them into these classes. Here's some examples. Dravidian peoples of southern India, very dark-skinned, perfectly straight hair. Okay? Skin color and hair texture do not vary together. They're independent variables. Or here's a man from Somalia, dark skin, long, narrow nose. Doesn't have the broad, flat nose that Negroids are supposed to have. Okay? You can't classify him into that category. We think of the epicanthic folds, these folds on the eyes that make the eyes look like they're slanted. Nobody has slanted eyes, but they're folds in the middle or the inside or the outside of the eye that make the eyes look slanted. And we associate that, of course, with East Asian peoples, where they're very common. But the epicanthic folds are found in other parts of the world today, and you can maybe look around this room and find people that to one degree or another have epicanthic folds and are not of Asian descent. Here's a man from Ireland who has very pronounced ones, a girl from Africa, especially in South Africa. There's among native black peoples, there are lots and lots of people with epicanthic folds. This is not an East Asian trait. It doesn't go with the skin color that we associate with the East Asians or with the straight hair we associate with East Asians. It's an independent variable. It tends to be concentrated in East Asia, but it's found in all parts of the world. Or dark-skinned Aboriginal peoples in Australia who have very blonde hair. And this is not from interbreeding with the Anglo-Australians, but it's part of their population. So, and black-haired, blue-eyed Irishmen and so forth. You can go to any country on Earth, you can have an idea of what people are supposed to look like, and then you find all kinds of exceptions. And again, the idea is that these racial traits do not go together in packages. Just because you have a certain skin color does not mean you also have this and this and this and this. And the third problem with the classification, I like to say that these racial classifications are arbitrary and capricious. Geneticists now know that we have approximately 23,000 genes in our DNA. On 23 pairs of chromosomes, approximately 23,000. They used to think it was about 100,000, but when they actually did the genome, they said, wow, there aren't that many. But of those 23,000 genes, all of the racial traits from like that Negroid classification, if you count up how many genes are involved in those 7 traits, it's probably on the order of about 30 or 40. We don't know exactly for all of those traits, but we have a pretty good idea. 30 or 40 traits out of 23,000. You're basing classification on the slimmest of evidence. What about the other 22,960 genes that you're ignoring? Why aren't they important? The reason we focus on those 30 or 40 genes is because they're the ones that pop out at us when we look at somebody. They're the ones that are most conspicuous, and that's a terrible reason for classifying people. It has nothing to do with what is biologically important. And let me give you some other examples of human variability. Earwax, that's a Q-tip on the upper left with some earwax on it. Pleasant picture this morning. Yeah, at least it's not a booger. Turns out, I never knew this, but I grew up in small town Minnesota. It turns out that humans basically have one of 2 kinds of earwax. There's the kind of yellowish, sticky kind that most of you are probably familiar with because it's very common in Europe. And then in parts of East Asia and in other parts of the world, there's an earwax that is grayer in color and it's much drier. It's not so sticky. And there's one gene that determines which kind of earwax you have. And so there's no cline, apparently. It's either one or the other. How many of you can roll your tongues? Let's see it. Should be about half of you can roll your tongues, the other half can't. This is not a learned trait. Either you can do it or you can't. It's genetic. I don't know of anybody that can teach themselves to do it without the help of some device. And I don't know why you'd want to do that, but why don't we use that for defining races? It's simple. Stick out your tongue and roll it. And if you can't roll it, well, you're not one of us. Get out of here. There are other simple traits. This is called Darwin's tubercle. It's actually an atavistic trait from our ancestors, the monkeys, where some of them have pointed ears, but at any rate, you have it or you don't have it. Earlobes vary quite a bit. Oh, here's another one I have to talk about without any knowledge of my own my own trait, but hair whorls are either clockwise or counterclockwise. Some people, I guess, have 2 whorls, right? But I don't know, do they both go the same way? But most people either have a clockwise or a counterclockwise whorl. And again, this is not a clinal trait. You have one or the other. So all I'm saying is, why don't we use these for racial identifications? It turns out if you wanted a good racial category, say, all right, let's divide humans into 2 groups, tongue rollers and non-rollers. Or counterclockwise, clockwise hair whorl. And you can identify any person except me. I escape. And that would be an easy, there are no clines here. It's either or. And once you identify that, you know who to kill. Because that's basically why we define racial traits, to know who our enemies are. But this idea, we have 23,000 genes, and only 30 or 40 of them come into use in racial classifications, should make you stop and wonder, well, why? And why do we focus on just the highly visible traits? You can see a person's skin color from a block away. It's easy to identify, must be important. It's not important. And it's important in protecting you from the sun. But in dividing up humans, it turns out it's not important at all. If we wanted, again, to do a classification, we could classify people on the basis of blood type. You're all familiar with the ABO system and the Rh negative positive system. It turns out there are actually 28 different known systems for typing human blood. tremendous variation. I don't know what this Lutheran one is, but I think if you have that, it makes you wear, I don't know, hush puppies or... At any rate, if you wanted to classify people into meaningful categories, these are categories we can actually identify. They're not subjective, like, what's your skin color? Are you a 27 or a 26? I'm not sure. Here we know exactly what your blood type is. But we don't do that because you can't look at a person and know what their 28 different blood types are. So this might be a much more important way, because it turns out that different blood types have different advantages and disadvantages. Turns out that, I forget the details now, but type A in India turned out to provide, was it more or less protection against smallpox? But there are adaptive advantages we don't even know about, and there are a few that we do know about. But if you wanted to classify people, classify them on these blood types. That would make more sense, but we don't do it, as I say, because we can't see it. You have to send them into a lab and prick their finger and do all sorts of antibody tests to figure out what they are. So we don't bother with it. Well, that's a bad reason not to classify on that basis. Okay, are you still with me? Boy, I must be talking a lot. I'm getting awful dry here. Evolution and genetics. I got two more problems. I'll take this. These are numbers 6 and 7, I think. There's our old friend DNA. So, remember, one of the misconceptions about race was that, first, if you accept that there are human races, most people believe that these races have been around for a very, very long time. Yeah. The Jewish Bible traces them back to Noah and his offspring, right? Evolution doesn't talk about different races except different subspecies like Neanderthals. But at any rate, people think that, well, people have been different from each other for thousands and thousands of years. And it turns out that's not true. And in fact, it turns out we have evidence that it's not true, and it also doesn't make any sense. It's illogical. And a couple of illustrations here. This is a map some of you may have seen. This is based on mitochondrial DNA. And there are other similar maps based on Y chromosomes, and now geneticists are looking at the entire human genome and making similar maps, basically tracing major human migrations over the last 100,000 years. And what we know for sure is that all roads lead back to Africa. And in fact, they're even pretty sure they know what part of Africa. But all humans are ultimately Africans. We all have a common origin. And as we spread out of Africa and adapted to different environments, our traits changed. But also our traits changed as we interbred with other populations, which we have been doing continually for thousands and thousands of years. So we don't have separate origins for humans. We have a single origin. And let's look at an example here. Here's a photograph of some Bantu peoples from Central Africa on the left. On the right, some Papuans from New Guinea. Okay, live a long ways apart. Why do they look somewhat similar physically? The traditional answer was because the Papuans are descended from the Bantus and from similar peoples in Africa. Turns out that's not the correct answer. And we know this from genetics now. They are very different populations. Ultimately, we're also Africans, but we're no more Africans than the people from New Guinea. They're no more African than we are. Okay? The reason they look similar is because their ancestors, tens of thousands of years ago, adapted to similar equatorial environments. And to stress this, let's look at another picture. Last year when I gave my lecture upstairs, I took a picture of some of you. There you are before class started, talking about how I hope he makes it shorter today. Let's do a social experiment here. We're going to move all of you from Wausau to Kenya. Keep talking about Kenya, but it's as good an example as any in East Africa. We're going to move there and going to do a couple of things. you can't take any sunscreen, no broad-brimmed hats, and you're going to dress like the local people. You're not going to interbreed with the local people. But you're going to settle there with your children and grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and your descendants are going to remain there for 5,000 years. And if we go back in 5,000 years and check on your descendants, what are they going to look like? They're going to look a lot more like this than they do today. Because without sunscreen, without cultural aids to protect them from the sun, the ones that are going to survive and have children and not have folate deficiencies, not die from skin cancer, are the ones that are going to have the mutations for darker skin. The darker skin is going to provide them with protection, make them more survivable. They're going to have more offspring. Over thousands of years, they're going to become a darker skin population. They're going to develop the curlier hair, the broader nose. You have to take my word for it, because this is a thought experiment. We can't actually do this. But think about it. That makes sense. That makes sense, right? We would eventually become much more like them in appearance. And eventually they would forget that we were from Wausau and we talked funny. Okay. Number 7. Boy, genetics. This is where I had to do a lot of updating, because every year there's more and more information coming to light. Some of you have probably done Ancestry and 23andMe and so forth, and had your genome read and categorized, and they'll send you information about what part of the world your ancestors are from and so forth. There are a lot of problems with that, and I don't really have time to go into it, and I'm not an expert on it. But at any rate, what we know from genetic studies of humans around the world, which have been going on since the 1980s, is that who you're similar to genetically has nothing to do with your skin color, has nothing to do with your hair texture, nothing to do with these other common racial traits. You could be sitting next to a very dark-skinned man from Kenya, and next to your spouse, who looks a lot like you in terms of racial traits, and it's very, very possible that you are more similar genetically to the Kenyan than you are to your spouse. The fact that you look alike, you have similar skin color and so forth, is completely irrelevant to your genetic makeup. Remember, that's probably about 8 genes out of 23,000. And this has been shown over and over again. We've got a nice little video in the library here of a class of high school students that actually did this. They took blood samples and they submitted them for testing, and it was a class that consisted of American students, but of African descent, Asian descent, European descent, Native American descent. And they looked at all their DNA, and of course they expected that they were similar genetically to the people that looked like them, and it turned out that wasn't true at all. Wasn't true at all. And in fact, we've known since the 1980s that if you use these traditional racial classifications, I got to finish up very quickly, I'm sorry I'm running over. If you use these traditional racial classifications and you compare genetically these different groups, that on average, only about 6% of all human biological variability can be found from one of these so-called races to the next. If you subdivide them in so-called subraces, smaller groupings, about another 9%. Where is most human variability? It's from person to person, regardless of your race. 85% of genetic variability is from one person to the next, regardless of their skin color and of these other so-called traits. So if that doesn't disprove the race concept, I don't know what it'll take to get you to believe me. I got to move on quickly, sorry, but both these houses are white, but there's a lot of difference. And just same genetically, 2 people can be white, but genetically they can be quite different. And I'm going to take you through quickly. Just look at Europe. This has been done all over the world now. We get more and more tests. Just in Europe, what's been going on in Europe? Starting about 9,000 years ago, we had people from the Near East moving in with farming, and then later we had herders moving in from Russia and Ukraine, and then we had the Indo-Europeans coming in from South Central Asia, and they moved all over Europe. And then we had Beaker culture archaeologists identified that started replacing some of these populations and they're breeding with others. And we had the Celts move in and Iron Age peoples coming from different parts of Europe and Asia and the Middle East. And then we had the Vikings spreading out and casting their genes all around Europe. And then we had the Mongols coming from East Asia. And I mean, this is just in Europe. And in all parts of the world, we've had these massive migrations over the last thousands of years. And all of us are highly mongrelized. The Hanseatic League changed the genetic makeup of Northern Europe because we have these merchants from Germany settling all over and spreading, and Scandinavians moving down farther south and so forth. And if you look at London today, the genetic makeup of citizens in London is just incredibly diverse. And even this area of the blue, which is identified as white British, is an extremely complicated mix of peoples. And this is the way all humans are on Earth, and it's just become impossible to identify them. The only reasons for identifying people in different races is to exploit them, perpetuate social and economic inequality, to identify our enemies, to scapegoat people when things go wrong in society. You have to have people you pick on, right? And that's been always the purpose of racial classification. It doesn't serve much purpose. Is there any good to it at all? Basically, it's useful to talk about human diversity in terms of medical treatments because some populations are more prone to certain diseases, heart attacks and sickle cell anemia and on and on. We can't ignore that. That's true. We have to, certain people with certain genetic traits are more prone to certain diseases. But if we look at this, back to the same picture, I just want to leave you with one thought. It's not necessary or wise to ignore human biological diversity. We don't want to pretend it doesn't exist because it does exist. We just want to realize that grouping people into these categories is nonsense, and it's much more harmful than it is useful. So, sorry I didn't leave a lot of time, but thank you. Have a little time for questions, I think. A couple of questions. Yes?
So which is better, star-bellied sneak or the plain-bellied sneak?
I try to avoid political comment here. I don't know. I'm not familiar with those. Other questions? No? Okay. I talked too long. I apologize. But
Ron,
is there someone in the back? Okay. Sorry.
What do you suggest that we use in terminology then instead of terms that are thrown around like racial justice or racial injustice? How would you suggest we reform our linguistics?
Anthropologists have been fighting for decades to try to eliminate those questionnaires on surveys about, pick your race. And now mostly instead of race, they use the word ethnicity. Or they say race/ethnicity. We need to get rid of the word race because it's used completely incorrectly. Ethnicity is a valid term because it refers to people's cultural differences. In terms of genetics, like treating people with certain predispositions for diseases, we have to, medical practitioners have to be able to identify people, populations of people that are prone to certain diseases. And how you do that, well, you do it by talking about their genome and not talking about the race, I guess. Let's just get rid of the word entirely because it's just so corrupted. I don't know if that answered the question or not, but it's not easy to do to overcome literally millennia of belief that these are valid categories. One over here.
What is the purpose of my rolling my tongue?
Yeah,
Is there a reason?
I don't know. It's a good question. Since I can't roll my tongue, I feel a little bit at a disadvantage. But it's interesting. There are genetic differences among humans. We have no idea why these differences exist. They may simply have been a mutation, and it served no purpose. It wasn't harmful. If it's a harmful mutation, it'll be bred out of the population. But if it's a neutral mutation, it neither helps you nor hinders you in having children, which is about what evolution is about, then it just sticks around. So it may have been just sort of a random change that gave people these weird tongues. Or gave me the weird tongue, I'm not sure which. Okay, well, thanks a lot. Glad to see you guys again, and